understand a little bit more about your strategic vision for the Institute. Would you briefly identify your current strategic priorities and how they relate to your four main scientific areas of emphasis?
So we've divided up the four major areas of emphasis of NIAID into HIV-AIDS, infectious diseases other than HIV-AIDS, which include the standard established infections, emerging and reemerging infections, and even biodefense, such as having defense against anthrax or other attacks. That's the second. The third is basic and clinical immunology, basic and clinical research in the immune system, understanding how it works, diseases of aberrant function of the immune system or deficiency of the immune system. And the fourth area is global health.
Okay.
So the vision of where we want to go with that. HIV-AIDS, after 3+ decades now of a devastating pandemic, we have the scientific basis now with prevention modalities and treatment that's highly effective and a quest, but not yet accomplished, towards a vaccine. We feel we can turn around the trajectory of the pandemic so that the vision is that within a reasonable period of time, we'll see an AIDS-free generation. And by that, we mean the tipping point where the number of new infections is less than the number of people who are put on therapy, and the deflection of the pandemic starts to go down as opposed to what it's been doing for a few decades is going up. So that's a vision there. The vision for emerging and reemerging infectious diseases is to develop what we call platforms of vaccines and drugs where we don't have to keep chasing after each individual new emerging and reemerging drug, that we have capabilities of being able to rapidly sequence, of being able to develop what we call platforms for vaccines and therapies that would be more universal rather than trying to chase after everything that might emerge. With regard to immunology, it's just fundamental, good, sound, basic research to understand the mechanisms of immune function and how we might suppress aberrant mechanisms and enhance deficient mechanisms. And then the last one is global health. We know now, and we've realized it for quite a while, that we live in a global community. So the idea that there are diseases that we worry about and there are diseases that other people worry about is just an antiquated concept. Right now, we live economically, from a strategic standpoint, from a political standpoint, from a security standpoint, we live in a global community. So global health, be it AIDS in Africa or malaria in the Far East or other diseases, dengue in South America, are all things that we're interested in because we have to function in a global community.
I'd like to tackle infectious diseases and understand there's certain characteristics of infectious diseases that set them apart from other human diseases. Could you explain what they are and perhaps give us a broad category of infectious diseases?
Well, okay, so if you look at infectious diseases, they do have a number of unique characteristics, one of the most important of which is that if you look evolutionarily how a human develops over millennia, you know, if you look at how evolution brings you from a situation where you have skills or not, and then you develop them over thousands of years. Microbes have the capability through mutations of changing characteristics in minutes to days because their replication capability, so we replicate every 18 to 27 years. Microbes, like HIV, replicate thousands of times per day. And when you replicate, you have the risk of there being a mutation. Now, that mutation may have no effect on your function, or it might have a significant effect on your ability to spread from one person to another, on your ability or not to be virulent, namely to make someone really sick. So when you're talking about infectious diseases, it's a constant evolution. You have a disease, it spreads, you develop a drug, you treat a person, and then all of a sudden, after a period of years, the virus or the bacteria develops resistance, and you got to come in with another drug. So it isn't an open and shut case. We've dealt with that problem. It's a constant, dynamic, emerging world of microbes that will never completely, for sure, wipe out the human species, but it constantly is adapting itself to its own survival. So when you think of infectious diseases, it's a mysterious and in many respects wonderful world of evolving viruses and bacteria and others. It's something that we need to stay a step ahead of it when we think in terms of how we intervene with therapies or vaccines or diagnostics. It's different in many respects from diseases that have a relatively stable profile. This isn't a particularly stable profile. It's constantly changing.
Are there broad categories associated with
them? Well, I tend to think of major categories of infectious diseases as established diseases. And by an established disease, I mean I could talk to you today and predict next year how many people will get sick and how many people will die. You can generally do that with tuberculosis, with malaria, with diarrheal diseases, with respiratory diseases, and even now, after 3 decades, with HIV-AIDS. Then there's the surprises that you spoke about, the emerging and reemerging infectious disease. Are we going to have a pandemic of influenza next year or not? In the 20th century, we had 3 pandemics, 1918, 1957, and 1968. In the 21st century, we had one in 2009. Thank goodness it was relatively mild, but it was still a pandemic. So if you want to categorize infectious diseases, you can categorize them into what's established, which still is a challenge to do something about them because we really need to address these established diseases. And there's the completely unpredictable emerging and reemerging infectious diseases.
And I want to touch now on, it's 30 years you've alluded to of research into basic and applied in HIV/AIDS. What's happening to date? What's the new protocols? Can you tell us a little bit about the therapeutics that are available now? And then down the road, is there a potential for a vaccine?
Well, HIV/AIDS, I believe, is really a classic textbook case of how you go from a completely mysterious, virtually uniformly fatal disease that's transmissible, involving potentially and in reality tens of millions of people. How you go from not even knowing what the agent is in 1981, 2, and then 3 when the agent was discovered, and then fast forward 30 years to where we are today, where we now have therapies, which when I was taking care of HIV-infected individuals in the mid-'80s and early '90s, the median survival of my patients was 6 to 8 months, which means that 50% of the patients would be dead in 6 to 8 months, which is horrible. There's almost no disease that's that bad. And yet, by taking fundamental basic research, understanding the replication cycle, targeting the vulnerable components of that replication cycle, and designing drugs that we now have more than 30 FDA-approved antiretroviral drugs, which when used in combination and given to a person like who's 25 years old and recently infected, unlike what I faced in the 80s when there was a 6 to 8 month median survival, now if I put someone on drugs, the triple combinations which are available, I can look that person in the eye and tell them that I could predict that they would likely live an additional 50 years. There's almost nothing in biomedical research and health that's as dramatic a turnaround over a 30-year period as that. That's treatment. We have good ways of prevention, some that are low-tech, condom use, needle exchange, behavioral modification, and some that require medical intervention, treating mothers to prevent transmission to a baby at the time of birth and through breastfeeding, circumcision, pre-exposure prophylaxis, etc. The real holy grail that we're waiting on now, in the sense of not waiting, we're actively pursuing, is the development of a vaccine, and then hopefully the aspirational issue of can we cure people? Because right now, you can dramatically turn around someone's prognosis by treating them with antiretroviral drugs, but they have to be on drugs for the rest of their lives. The question is, can we cure people? Can we get to the point where you suppress the virus enough that you could stop the drug and the virus won't rebound? I don't know if we're going to be able to get there, but it's certainly an aspiration worth trying. The real holy grail of turning the epidemic around is getting an HIV vaccine. And I would say over the last 2 to 2.5, 3 years, the advances in understanding the light at the end of the tunnel for vaccine is much more than what we had seen in the previous 15 to 20 years. So I don't know when we're going to get a vaccine, but the last couple of years have been very, very encouraging about that direction.
Right.